Joining us now is Will Chamberlain. He's an attorney and the publisher of Human Events. Will, thank you for being with us. Will, you've been making the point that the tech companies may have sped up this legal process against them because of their recent ramping up of bans on conservative voices online. But hasn't this regulation been in the works for years now anyway?
I mean, it might have been, but Republicans have historically been very reluctant to pursue antitrust investigations against companies. They've generally taken a pro-business line. So for the Trump administration to decide to be bringing these cases against Facebook and Google and other companies as well indicates that there's probably something more going on here, especially after President Trump said he was monitoring these companies about 2 weeks ago. All
right, so if these antitrust cases and then other actions are filed, do the big tech companies have an argument that they are now being targeted for their perceived anti-Trump favoritism? I mean, won't a lot of federal judges agree with that?
I mean, I don't think that's going to play into it. The real question is whether or not they're in violation of the Antitrust Act and whether they've engaged in anti-competitive activity. And in the case of both Facebook and Google, there's a pretty good argument to be made that they are, in fact, monopolies. Google has what seem to be pretty clear monopolies on search and live video viewing. And then Facebook has a monopoly on what I would call friends and family social media. And both exploit those monopolies. And go ahead.
But, Will, considering the trend has been to make most issues about President Trump, is that not a concern that federal judges will make this a President Trump issue?
I don't think so. I mean, I look at these companies and I look at how federal judges generally operate, and they're worried about being overturned on appeal. If a federal judge wrote an opinion that said this company would be a monopoly, but President Trump is a bad guy, that obviously would get overturned. So it's really going to come down to whether or not the Trump administration and the Department of Justice can demonstrate that these companies are monopolies and are abusing their anti-competitive position in a way that violates the antitrust laws.
All right, what is your response to the argument that these are private companies and that people being banned from their platforms should just go somewhere else or start their own social media platforms, that they have the right to do this as essentially publishers? They can let who they want publish on their platforms.
My view is that platform access is a civil right. In the 1960s, in the early 1960s at least, restaurants and hotels could discriminate on the basis of race, and they made the exact same argument. They argued that they were private companies and that forcing them to serve whoever was a violation of their freedom of association. But as a society, we decided that in order to have a meaningful commitment to non-discrimination, we had to impose laws and force companies to stop discriminating on the basis of race. Similarly, we have a cultural commitment to free speech, but in 2019, to have meaningful free speech, you need to have access to Facebook and Twitter. They're the center of the public square. And so if Facebook and Twitter are able to ban you on a whim, then they're really able to violate people's civil rights, and they shouldn't be able to do that.
Well, it's very disconcerting that there still isn't a clear standard or guideline or criteria as to what gets people banned from these platforms. I mean, why has there not been a bigger push to at least make that known and for those standards to be upheld?
Well, obviously, Facebook and Twitter would oppose something like that because they would want to be in a position, they wouldn't want anybody to be able to sue them for failure to meet certain standards. And in general, Republicans have been reluctant to try and regulate because they are rightly reticent to regulate generally. But here there really does need to be new law put in place to force there, at a minimum, to be real process, real due process for people who lose their accounts. Because rules without process, they're not worth the paper they're written on.
What do you make of the excuse or response that we get from these social media giants like Twitter and Facebook that a lot of these deletions or purges were accidents, that it was not intentional?
Oh, I mean, for most of them, that's just silly. We've seen plenty of documents suggesting that these companies are looking out for conservatives, and we know that Facebook and Twitter are staffed top to bottom by progressives in Silicon Valley, that they have company cultures that are deeply hostile to conservatives. The idea that this is an accident, it's just not true.
And when Twitter bans people that have been critical of the Chinese government, saying that they thought that they were fake accounts or bots, I mean, what's your response to that?
I mean, it doesn't really matter what the answer is, whether that was intentional or not. It indicates a major, major problem at Twitter. If it's intentional, it means that Twitter is doing the bidding of the Chinese government, which is a massive problem. And if it was unintentional, it means that the Chinese government is able to exploit flaws in Twitter's reporting system to censor people it doesn't like. In either case, Twitter has a very, very serious problem on its hands that it needs to deal with.
Well, thank you so much, Will Chamberlain. Appreciate it.